My name is Loren Cass. I'm in the Political Science Department and the Director of the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies, and I'll be moderating today's panel discussion along with my colleagues here from across the college. I'm going to keep my comments fairly short today. Today's discussion is really Pope Francis's encyclical letter, Laudato Si, on care for our common home. Care for our common home. I'd like to thank the Director of Environmental Studies, Professor Sarah Mitchell, who's here, for organizing the panel. It was her idea, along with Professor Worcester's idea, to bring together a group of people to try to respond to this, to the encyclical. I also want to just note at this time that this is the first of what will be several events on both the Pope's visit to the United States, but also on Laudato Si. So there'll be a viewing party here in Ream Library on Thursday at 9:45 a.m., and that'll be followed by a group of faculty that'll reflect on his presentation to Congress, the address to Congress. So feel free to come back at 9:45. We'll have a conversation then. On October 1st at 4 o'clock, again here, there will be a panel discussion on Pope Francis, moderated by WGBH radio host and Crux columnist Marjorie Egan. So feel free to come back for that one on October 1st. There'll be an additional panel on October 6th at 4 o'clock here in Ream Library as well. So many of opportunities to engage with this document and try to understand what it means for us as a community. I'll keep my remarks very short right here, but I want to emphasize two key points from the encyclical that I think are important to this panel. First, Pope Francis is very clear in the encyclical that the intended audience is not limited to Catholics. He says very explicitly, he says, quote, "In this encyclical, I would like to enter into dialogue with all people, about our common home." We see this as an invitation, and thus our respondents today will seek to engage the encyclical from a variety of disciplines as well as points of view, with time at the end to engage your ideas and your views in the dialogue as well. So that's part of the intent. The second point is that Pope Francis emphasizes that this dialogue is desperately needed now. And there's an urgency to his call. He notes in the encyclical that, quote, "I urgently appeal then for a new dialogue about how we are shaping the future of our planet. We need a conversation which includes everyone, since the environmental challenge we are undergoing and its human roots can concern and affect us all." This dialogue is not intended to be an academic exercise. Right? This is a call to action. And so we may debate how we should respond, but we must begin by doing something. And that's part of what the Pope is calling us to here. So our panel will begin today with Professor Wolfe-Bellin, who will speak to the environmental and scientific foundations for the encyclical. Professors Worcester and Eggemeier will then address the historical and theological context. And finally, Professors Kiel and Harvey will address the social context for responding to the problems highlighted by Pope Francis. Each professor will speak for approximately 6 minutes. Not much time, 6 minutes. After that, we'll open the dialogue to you. Again, you should have received a card. If you didn't, you can raise your hand. We'll hand those out to you. If you have any questions along the way, jot them down. Just jot down on the card. We'll collect them at the end and try to gather those together. We'll then open the floor to discussion and comment from you, and I will collect the cards, try to pull together themes from those, and present those to the panel as well afterwards. Okay. With that, I think I'll turn it over to Professor Wolfe-Bellin. Thank you.
Thank you, Loren. Thank you all for coming here today. So, in the introduction to this encyclical letter, Pope Francis quotes Pope Paul VI, who in 1971 wrote of the urgent, quote, "urgent need for a radical change in the conduct of humanity," end quote, in order to avert the environmental degradation and ecological catastrophe. And as we all noted in our previous discussions on this, Pope Francis repeatedly uses this word urgent to describe the current state of how we humans are caring for our common home. Pope Francis begins chapter 1, which is entitled, "What is Happening to Our Common Home?" by noting the acceleration of changes affecting humanity and the planet. And he even uses a term called rapidification, that's rapidification, to describe the increasingly fast pace of life, and he links this back to the acceleration of changes that are affecting humans and the environment. Within this first chapter, Pope Francis reviews a long and well-researched, I might add, list of current environmental conditions. He discusses the increasing accumulation and storage of waste that is non-biodegradable, toxic, and that inordinately affects the poor of the world. He talks about increasing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which is leading to climate change. He talks about freshwater depletion and the lack of access to safe fresh water, which again inordinately affects the poor. He talks of the loss of biodiversity, overfishing in the world's oceans, deforestation of rainforests, loss of coral reefs, and really, finally, the decline even in the quality of human life. One aspect of these environmental issues leading to urgency is that measurable and accelerating change has really occurred quite recently, really from a historical perspective. The beginnings of most of these problems can be traced back to just the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, which from a historical context was a mere 200 years ago. So further, within this 200-year time frame, the first 150 years or so of this, the pace of change was rather gradual. But the pace of change switched to become much more drastic around the 1960s. And there has really been an acceleration in change during the 50 years since then. Take, for instance, climate change and related factors as examples. If you look at carbon dioxide, which is the most potent greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, it has increased twice as much within the past 50 years as it did even over the 150 years prior to that time. And it continues to increase by 1 to 2 parts per million every year, and there's really no, at the rate we're going, there's no stopping that, it looks like. Phenology, which is the timing of natural events, and those things are affected by climate warming, has also changed measurably. And just one example would be that if you look at trees at the latitude that we live at, they are leafing out approximately 1 week earlier every spring than they did just 50 years ago. To me, a week's change in an event like that is a phenomenal change in really what is the course of a single human lifespan. Finally, I just read a recent news story reporting about the occurrence of nuisance flooding and how it's increased. Now, this is flooding that occurs at high tide that can lead to road closures if you're in a major city, and it's really caused by sea level rise. 50 years ago, this was not an issue, and now they're saying that it's common at least once every month at high tides in cities up and down the Atlantic coast of the U.S. So bear in mind, these changes might seem to encompass large expanses of time, particularly for the students in the room who might have been born more in the 1990s. But to put it into some context, these changes are within your parents' lifetimes. So that's a pretty fast rate of change. And in fact, the changes are continuing to accelerate. So I often hear students, in fact, using language implying that things like environmental change, and particularly climate change, are things that they're concerned about, well, for their your children or maybe your children's children. But I would actually say that you should pause and consider that these are changes that will occur during your lifetime and probably during my lifetime. So this rapidification, or this acceleration of environmental change, is what has Pope Francis concerned and encouraging this sense of urgency. In this encyclical, Pope Francis reminds us that sometimes in periods of deep crisis that require bold decisions, we are tempted to think that what is happening is not really clear, or that changes might not look that serious if you look sort of over the course of your life experience. In environmental science, there is a term for this lack of recognition for a larger trend that occurs over large time spans, and we call it a shifting baseline. So, and this is where each new generation kind of lacks knowledge of the prior state of the environment, and thus redefines what is natural and what seems normal. And that sets the stage then for the next generation shifting and ultimately an inaccurate baseline. So Pope Francis in this encyclical is reminding us not to fall into the complacency of this shifting baseline. Remember that complacency and continued inaction, which is kind of what we're doing, right, and maintaining really this business as usual model, both in terms of individual actions and really our current social, political, and economic models, really is a decision. It's a decision toward inaction. So, and we cannot afford inaction or even indifference. Really, the state of our common home is indeed an urgent matter. Thank you.
One of the early paragraphs in Laudato Si, it's paragraph 3, in fact, is a kind of historical analogy that Francis proposes between the situation today regarding the environment and the situation in the early 1960s, early to mid-1960s, in the midst of the Cold War. He says, more than 50 years ago, with the world teetering on the brink of nuclear crisis, Pope St. John XXIII wrote an encyclical which not only rejected war, but offered a proposal for peace. You may recall that Pope Francis canonized John the 23rd not too long ago. He even waived the requirement of a miracle to do it. I think it's obvious in a number of ways that John the 23rd is an exceptionally important predecessor for Francis. Of course, Francis did not choose an earlier pope for his own name, which is extremely unusual. And yet, I would suggest that John the 23rd is in fact his most significant role model, if you like. And so that if you study the papacy of John the 23rd, 1958 to 63, it will give you some clues about what Francis thinks his job is as Pope. And so I was not surprised to see him early on in the encyclical already talking about John the 23rd. Now, as a historian, a question that arises for me is this analogy one that stands up? Most analogies have strengths and weaknesses. They do shed light on the question, but they may also have some limits. He mentions the world teetered on the brink of nuclear crisis. When I hear that, I hear the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. I'm actually old enough to remember that. That sometimes shocks my students. I was 7 years old that month, and I do remember people expecting immediate annihilation. That would not be an exaggeration. I was afraid that this evil man Khrushchev was going to come and kill me, and that sort of thing. That was a 7-year-old's reaction. It's not something you forget. I mean, I think anybody who was alive at that time, even as a child, will have a very clear memory of the fear that that engendered and the sense of imminent destruction of the world, quite literally. So the question that I have is the situation regarding the environment, is it as urgent as that? That might be a bit of an overstatement, but I don't know if it's as much as we might like to think, as was just suggested. Francis also mentions specifically the encyclical then that John the 23rd published a few months after the Cuban Missile Crisis, Pacem in Terris, in April of 1963, Peace on Earth, an encyclical that was published actually just a few weeks before Pope John's death. I would say an extremely important encyclical for a development of, you could say, Catholic teaching on war, further in the direction of rejecting the notion of just war, and especially in regard to nuclear war, the idea of a just nuclear war, clearly not, and perhaps not any just war. Again, Francis clearly very influenced by that, and is trying to take from John the 23rd, I think, some of the sense of urgency and also of addressing the whole world. Again, here Francis mentions that John the 23rd addressed that encyclical to all men and women of goodwill. And Francis then says, now faced as we are with global environmental deterioration, I wish to address every person living on this planet. He says, in my apostolic exhortation on the joy of the gospel, I wrote to all members of the church with the aim of encouraging ongoing missionary renewal. In this encyclical, I would like to enter into dialogue with all people about our common home. Again, the question being, how do we respond to that urgency? Perhaps, again, not quite as urgent as the Cuban Missile Crisis, where John the 23rd played a role in diffusing it, in fact. I mean, Pope Francis, who's played a role in improving relations between the United States and Cuba, John the 23rd was one of the key figures in functioning as a mediator between President Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev. So he's one of the people who helped, you could say, prevent nuclear war in October of '62. So again, Francis, who's mediated between Cuba and the United States, is following the example set by John the 23rd. Absolutely. Right. Maybe I'll stop there.
I always tell my students when they read a theologian that they should try and get a sense of the cultural diagnosis that the theologian is presenting to us, what collectively ails us, what prevents us from having a deeper, more profound relationship with God. And in Laudato Si, Francis's encyclical, a deepened relationship with God should manifest itself in terms of a more just relationship with human beings and in terms of care for creation. It strikes me that Pope Francis's cultural diagnosis is clear in Laudato Si as well as other areas of his writings and his speeches. He makes the disturbing, disruptive, and I think countercultural claim that all of us in varying degrees are tempted by idols, by idolatry. This is quite different from the diagnosis given by his predecessor, Benedict XVI, who was Pope from 2005 to 2013. I think that Pope Benedict's cultural diagnosis is that we are consumed by secularism, or at least Western culture is consumed by secularism. So that Pope Benedict was always doing battle in some real way with atheism. It was the Catholic faith versus atheism. I think Pope Francis has shifted the terrain of the debate to a certain extent and suggests that we ought to be doing battle with idols, and one idol in particular. An idol in the Catholic theological tradition, of course, is a false god. And what Pope Francis wants to focus on is not so much that people are going around devoting their lives to Zeus or something like that, believing in Zeus. What he wants to focus on is what are we doing concretely with our time, our attention, our energy? What are we devoting it to? What are we giving our life over to? And according to him, and this is one of the most repeated kind of phrases of his papacy, the contemporary idol that dominates our world is money, quite straightforwardly. He turns to the Old Testament in Exodus 32 to talk about the fact that we've created a new golden calf, but he could have gone back to this obscure fellow from Nazareth 2,000 years ago who said you can't serve two masters, God or money. That's, of course, Jesus, and that's in Matthew 6:24. So what are the consequences of the dominance of this idol in our lives? First, according to Pope Francis, we devote ourselves to what he has variously referred to as unbridled, idolatrous, or a faceless economy, a faceless form of capitalism. In Laudato Si, he talks about the ways in which a techno-economic paradigm dominates our lives. Pope Francis is clearly not an economist, and so his primary concern, it seems to me, is not to debate economists over the efficiency or adequacy of this or that policy, although he certainly continues the tradition that began with Rerum Novarum in 1891, the first modern social encyclical in the Catholic Church, in which Pope Leo XIII said, look, communism is out of bounds as an economic ideology. Pope Francis, for his own part, in 2013, in his apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium, said, look, trickle-down economics is out of bounds for Catholic social teaching. So, I think what popes do in general is say, these things are out of bounds, but within this field, you have a lot of options that should be debated by politicians, economists, and so on and so forth. So if he's not interested in entering into a protracted debate with economists, what interests Pope Francis in relation to this idol, in relation to this economic order? What interests him is that this economic order shapes culture and produces particular types of human beings. According to him, human beings who are driven by self-interest and profit motives, and a culture whose overriding mandate is to consume more and more. It's interesting. When St. John Paul II was doing battle with communism in the late 1970s, in the 1980s, and then in the 1990s, this was his preoccupation, that communism is not simply an economic ideology. It's an ideology that pervades every dimension of one's life. It strikes me that's the fear that Francis has about certain strands of capitalism in the present. This broader situation in which culture is marketized is one of the reasons that Pope Francis argues in the first chapter of Laudato Si that we lack the culture to confront the environmental crisis. He says that we live in the midst of a throwaway culture. He repeated this yesterday in his remarks in Cuba. And for him, a throwaway culture is similar, or it gives rise to a culture of indifference. The example that he consistently brings up is that when the stock market plunges 100 points, we view this as an absolute catastrophe, and it generates virtually endless amounts of attention in the news and elsewhere. But when a poor, elderly, homeless person dies from exposure to the elements, it fails to register as a significant event. Our collective response to the ongoing destruction of the natural world is also one of indifference, according to Pope Francis. Perhaps we shrug our shoulders and say this will never affect us, at least in our lifetimes. We peddle the ideology that we must endure this type of what he terms collateral damage in the name of progress. Or perhaps most problematically, we engage in the type of widespread denialism that has taken hold in American culture. A 2014 Pew poll found that only 40% of Americans acknowledge that there is an anthropogenic, a human cause to climate change. 6 out of 10 Americans refuse what is a basic scientific fact. This is a deep issue, right? So if this is his diagnosis of our culture, and the call of the encyclical is, as Pope Francis says in section 49, to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, the question becomes, how do we go about doing this? And as a theologian, I'm interested in the theological response in particular. For Pope Francis, it is necessary to first refuse to accept the dominant ideology that there is no alternative to this social order and the sacrifices it demands. The sacrifice of the natural world, the sacrifice of the global poor, and the sacrifice of our collective future. I quote him. He says, "We should not consider this state of things irreversible. We should not resign ourselves to it. We must search to construct a society and an economy where the human person and the common good and not money is at the center," end of quote. The next step, after refusing to accept the dominant ideology that there is no alternative, is to describe alternative pictures of the world, to articulate different visions of the good life, to retrieve alternative systems of meaning. We need, as Pope Francis puts it in Laudato Si, a bold cultural revolution. We need, as Pope Francis puts it in Laudato Si, to, and I quote, slow down and look at reality in a different way. So for Francis, it's a question of optics. We need to reimagine our relationship to the natural world. We need to broaden our vision so that we see objects and things in the natural world as more than commodities to be extracted, consumed, and discarded for instrumental or economic purposes. This is the reason it seems to me that Pope Francis spends so much time reflecting on the doctrine of creation in the second chapter of Laudato Si. He is describing an alternative to the extractivist, commodifying mentality that dominates our culture. According to Pope Francis, the Catholic doctrine of creation provides us with a different frame or a different lens for interpreting reality. It says that God, not the market, created everything. And by virtue of that fact, everything that is has an intrinsic value. This, of course, is the meaning of the Catholic doctrine of creation. It says that there is a fundamental sacramentality to creation. What's a sacrament? It's a visible sign of God's presence. And the Catholic claim is that by virtue of the fact that God created the world, this means that each and everything in it is a sacrament. It has the potential to reveal God to us. As a consequence, it has an intrinsic significance which we must respect as well. If Catholics, just Catholics alone, 1 billion Catholics, took seriously this vision, that would be enough to begin to counteract a throwaway culture. Because what does a throwaway culture say? It says that certain things are not of value, that we can be indifferent towards them. A sacramental kind of vision of things would say that everything that is significant and deserves our respect and admiration. I want to end with a quote by the American environmentalist Wendell Berry that I think summarizes quite succinctly the spiritual and cultural challenge that Pope Francis puts before us. He's basically juxtaposing two different types of culture, a culture of desecration, which we live in now, and a culture of sacramentality. And so I'll end with this. To live, we must daily break the body and shed the blood of creation. When we do this knowingly, lovingly, skillfully, reverently, it is a sacrament. When we do it ignorantly, greedily, clumsily, destructively, it is a desecration. Thank you.
I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to comment on this papal encyclical. I read it both as an economist, which is what I am, as well as a resident of the common home that the Pope refers to. I greatly appreciate, as several other people have already mentioned, the urgency with which he talks about this particular problem. Climate change is happening. It is happening now. It is happening quickly. And if we want to do something about it, we need to act. In reading the encyclical as an economist, I could not help but notice the Pope's strong, often negative comments about the economy, in particular, the market economy that we have in the US. I'm not sure that he fully understands what the discipline of economics is. I do think he realizes that economists don't actually run the economy. We simply study it as it is and talk about, if we want to make changes to it, ways that we might consider making those changes. And he says some things which reveal that he misunderstands what economists actually talk about. So for example, he talks about this notion of unlimited growth being based on the idea that there is an unlimited supply of the earth's goods. That statement is one that every economist would reject. Our discipline is based at its heart on the idea that all resources are scarce, and that as a society we need to think very carefully about what we want to spend those resources on, what we want to dedicate them to. And when we talk about resources, we're not talking just about money. We're talking about goods. We're talking about natural resources. We're talking about time. We're talking about compassion. Those are goods which, unfortunately, are in scarce supply, and we need to think very carefully about how we want to use all of them. What I find interesting is that the Pope actually may be more of an economist than he would care to admit. I say that because when he talks about various environmental problems, he actually talks like an economist. He says, for example, that economic variables assign value that do not correspond to real worth. And that when we misstate true value, that will lead to the misuse of resources. In basic economic models, and I see many of you who I know have taken principles of economics, we call that a negative externality. We talk about it in principles of economics. A negative externality is a situation that occurs when a market does not fully capture all the costs that go into the production or consumption of a good when allocating the resources. And indeed, we end up with overproduction. Economists call this situation a market failure, when markets don't work. So markets don't work when true costs aren't revealed, exactly as the Pope has said. Economists argue that in that case, we should think about how to adjust the market, how to change the market, how to interact with the market to make it give us the result that we actually want, to make it think about as if it's a person. I'm anthropomorphizing. To make the market contain those costs when the resources are being allocated. There's several other examples in the encyclical of this, but the Pope talks about environmental issues using economic ideas, just not economic terminology. And I found that an interesting situation. He does distrust the market economy, and for this reason, he doesn't recommend solutions which are market-based solutions. He does ask for political action, he asks for individual action, and he asks for a discussion about how best to solve the problem. But he really is very leery of market-based solutions. In particular, he rejects cap-and-trade programs as a way to reduce environmental pollution around the world. He argues that those who are obsessed with maximizing profits will not stop to reflect on the damage they are causing now and in the future. Again, as an economist, and as most economists would say, we agree with him. We agree with him. I find a tension between that statement and a statement he makes later where he says it's important that polluters bear the costs of what they're doing. And cap and trade program, like taxes, like other kinds of command and control situations, are situations where firms do have to pay those costs. Economists feel that if something is free, we overconsume it. If you've ever been to an all-you-can-eat buffet, for example. If it's free to go back and get another plate of food, you might just do that. And it's when things are free that we end up having problems. So putting a price on something, as the Pope has actually argued for, is a way for us to make firms, to make individuals, to make countries think about what things truly cost. Pollution is not free, it has a cost. And by making us look at those costs, incorporate those costs, again, whether they're dollar costs or resource costs, it's something that we need to think about. But there are other ways of addressing the issue, other ways to come up with solutions. And the fact that the Pope has asked for a dialogue with all people, which I think includes economists as people, that we could have a meaningful conversation about what are the trade-offs, what are the costs, what are the benefits, what are some of the solutions we could be thinking about. I do appreciate his call for individuals to act. In our economic models, we assume that people do what makes them happy, that people try to maximize utility, which is just a fancy way of saying you try to make yourself happy. And what it is that makes you happy is up to you. As an economist, I have no right to tell you what should make you happy. But if people do choose to change the way they behave, if they choose to use less resources, if they choose to recycle rather than throw things in the trash, if they choose to close their dorm and office windows on cold days in order to save the amount of electricity needed to heat our buildings, then those are resources that we can put to other uses. And I can think of a lot of good things we could use those resources for. So I think that his call to action for individual change is one that I hope people will listen to. As an economist, I would like society to have a strong conversation about what our goals are. If our goals are income equality, if our goals are maximizing world happiness, if our goal is maximizing efficiency, whatever it is that we want our planet to be, we need to have a conversation about that. And then we need to have some real strong conversations about how are we going to make those things happen. And I think that economists, along with all the other disciplines, have something to say, something to contribute to that conversation. And I look forward to that conversation.
I frequently assign a book titled Heat Wave, written by a sociologist with the name of Eric Kleinenberg, to my sociology of disaster or environmental sociology students. It's about the 1995 heat wave in Chicago where close to 800 people died in less than 5 days. Students are often surprised that heat waves are among the most deadliest disasters. Kleinenberg went back to his hometown basically to find out who died and why. He discovered out that black people experienced higher mortality rates than whites, poor people died more readily than wealthy people, and the elderly had more fatalities than the young. But then he looked more carefully. He looked at what he calls the social fault lines and produced what he calls a social autopsy of the disaster. It's a terrific book. It's now a classic in sociology. One of the more interesting chapters looks at two neighborhoods, neighboring communities, North Lawndale, which had 40 deaths per 100,000 residents, and South Lawndale, which only had 4 deaths per 100,000 residents. Two contiguous neighborhoods, but one suffered 10 times the number of deaths. They were extremely similar. Basically, they had the same poverty rates, the same crime rates, and unemployment rates. Kleinenberg finds, though, that the main difference was connectedness. One neighborhood had abandoned buildings and open lots, degraded infrastructure, hardly any public life. The other had busy streets with spaces that promoted social contact and public engagement. They had different social ecologies, and it was a matter of life and death. In his encyclical, Pope Francis calls for us to examine human ecology and ultimate social ecology. For him, these two things are intricately linked. Social cohesion, the bonds of integration, are necessary for environmental change. As he writes in paragraph 48, the human environment and the natural environment deteriorate together. In paragraph 49, he continues, a true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. His emphasis. I tried to keep track of the times he wrote the common good or common home, but my pen ran out of ink. Clearly, he believes connectedness is essential for us to tackle climate change. To me, this is the heart of the encyclical. He writes, everything is related. The earth is a shared inheritance. This place is indeed our common home. I think the statement of the problem is quite clear, so the question is, how do we get to where we want to be? Pope Francis writes about ecological citizenship. It's a term I've been dealing with for about a year now in the title of a book I'm working on. He doesn't dwell on it much, but it's obvious that it underlies a good deal of what he writes. It goes to the idea that we all have a right to the earth. You cannot violate my right. Richer countries cannot violate the rights of poorer countries. These rights, of course, come with obligations. First and foremost, we are obliged to protect and defend the Earth's ecology. This idea of ecological citizenship connects us to each other and to future generations. But we don't think of the environment in this way. In my own research, this is why petrochemical companies in southeast Louisiana can destroy the wetlands, despite objections by residents for 4 decades, who then have to watch as their homes and communities are destroyed by a hurricane. The petrochemical companies were given more rights than the residents, and perhaps more radically, if we think about it, more rights than the wetlands. If corporations are people, then certainly wetlands, mountains, and oceans should be people too. Another book I've used, but only once because students thought it was extremely depressing, is Christian Parenti's Tropics of Chaos, Climate Change and the New Geography of Violence. Parenti basically looks at the convergence of climate change, militarism, and poverty. In it, he travels around the globe and he looks at water wars, battles over arable land, cattle raids, etc. He begins with the death of one man and then shows how these battles over resources pit one group against another, often involving the haves against the have-nots. He shows how suffering and dying on the front lines of this catastrophic convergence is already happening. He finds that those places that have reduced the threat of violence have done so by making people more accountable to one another, reducing economic differences, and increasing access to democracy. Basically the opposite of what we do here at home. We are, to use Pope Francis's words, facing not 2 separate crises, one environmental and one social, but rather one complex crisis. It is a matter of connectedness, a matter of substituting an us and them framework for something that emphasizes that climate change affects all of us. Because, as he writes, the whole is indeed greater than the parts. We don't have a planet with just parts. Right now, our military is preparing for climate wars. Countries are trying to figure out what to do with climate refugees, who now constitute the greatest category of refugee. Nations are developing security plans for the drastic changes climate change will cause. Right now, we've grown comfortable with the fact that one neighborhood might flood and its wealthier, wider sister neighborhood will stay dry. We accept that people elsewhere have to fight for resources, as long as it's not us. We can go another way. As Pope Francis writes in paragraph 202, a great cultural, spiritual, and educational challenge stands before us. I hope that this encyclical and the future discussions here at the college helps us to begin in earnest to take up that challenge.
So I think what we'll do right now, Sarah, if you want to collect the cards as you go on. If you have any questions, just pass them toward the middle. Sarah will collect those up. We'd also just like to open things up to everyone else at this point. There's a microphone in the middle of the floor. This is being taped and will be done who knows what with. But you can come up, ask your questions, anything you'd like a specific person, or if you'd like to ask several questions to the panel, please do so. But anyone would like to go first while we collect the cards? Don't be bashful.
Start with a question. So what then should we do? I mean, you talk a little bit, the Pope talks a little bit about recycling and stuff like that. Do any of you up in the panel have ideas, aside from closing our windows in the dorms, from these different perspectives? I mean, either from a theological perspective or, scientific perspective, like, what can I start doing today? Is there something?
One thing I would say about that is, I mean, when you talk about at the individual level, I think it does not only mean something that you might do along those lines of shutting your window or turning the air conditioning to a different setting or something like that, but the individual also may be involved in politics at the national level or the local level. There's a question of international agreements and so on. I mean, many people have commented that this encyclical is timed before a meeting that's coming up in Paris and so on. I mean, individuals can also play a role in the broader process. So I guess for me, I'd be cautious about too strong a dichotomy between individual action and something on a much bigger scale than that.
Yeah, I always fear when we privatize this problem and put it on the shoulders of individual agents. We all certainly need to change our lifestyles in view of what's going on, but I think we also have to put pressure on systems and politicians to change policy. Because I think, first and foremost, you need micro-political action. We need to change ourselves, and we need to enter into dialogue with local communities to build communities that can put pressure on people who can change things. But then we need massive macro-political change at the state level, at the national level, and even at the global level. And that's what Pope Francis insists upon. So I think it's got to go both directions at once, as it were. Grassroots, and we need the big policy changes.
But I would agree that the grassroots needs to inform, as I like to tell my students, we are the government. And so you don't like what your government is doing, you got to let somebody know. And complaining does not count.
And might I just point out, there are parts of the encyclical that feel as though, rightfully so, the United States is being targeted in not participating. And I would say that on the issue of climate change, the United States has absolutely not taken the lead on that. So I would encourage you to get involved, letting your politicians know that you're very unhappy with the direction that the U.S. is taking and really the lack of global leadership on that.
Just ask one of these questions. And again, if you want to ask questions, just move up to the mic and we'll take you after this. But one of the people asked about prioritizing social justice issues, that the Pope here is highlighting the environmental crisis. And yet we face any number of crises across the world related to poverty, wealth inequality, unemployment. Now you can argue that those are all intermingled, but how do you begin to prioritize whether the environment or other issues should be taken on as the top priority?
I think the Pope's answer would be that it's all connected, so that if we don't tackle climate change, for instance, who is it going to result in the worst effects for? It's going to be the global poor. I mean, in terms of cumulative CO2 emissions, United States bears disproportionate responsibility. We're about 4 or 4.5% of the global population, and historically, most analysts suggest we're responsible for around 25% of the cumulative emissions. The same is true when you talk about the relationship between the developed world and the underdeveloped world. The developed world is about 25% of the global population, and it's responsible for 75% of the cumulative CO2 emissions, right? We are going to be able to build up the infrastructure so we aren't as negatively affected by this. It's the global poor who are going to suffer the brunt of climate change in the coming decades. So if you want to attend to the rights of the global poor, this is one way to do so. It's all connected, as he says again and again in the encyclical.
And there's been some economic studies which have shown that climate change does impact the poor, and by affecting climate change, you can actually reduce poverty. And so I would agree, it's hard to pick. You shouldn't pick one over the other. It's got to happen all at the same time. But the nice thing is that there's going to be possibly some feedback loops, which could help.
As long as you're talking here, Kathy, we'll go and follow up with you as well. Someone that did ask, from an economist's perspective, you did sort of critique the Pope's perspective on the use of cap and trade and things like this. But you didn't necessarily get at the question of the underlying motivations and those who would enrich themselves in that process. Are there policies from an economic standpoint that could be used that would actually address the problem without just promoting further profiteering by those in the markets?
So cap and trade is a program where pollution is turned into a good that you have to purchase if you want to use it. So under a cap and trade program, which the U.S. has used very successfully with things like acid rain, no one has the right to pollute at all until they've purchased one of these permits. And so the notion is that now it's a good that you have to pay for if you want to use it, so people will be more careful in generating pollution because it has a cost. If you're concerned about the ability of certain groups to be able to purchase those, if you're worried about that, then the government could simply choose to give the permits to the poor people. I think when the Pope talks about, he's worried about profiteering, some of what he's talking about is these like offsets where you can pay money to have someone else reduce greenhouse gases sort of outside. And if people are uncomfortable with those, you can just say, we're not going to allow that. It's, you either have the permit or you don't have the permit. And if you have the permit, you can pollute, and if you don't have the permit, you can't pollute. And if you're worried about these equity issues, there's ways to design it. Cap and trade systems aren't perfect, just like any market isn't perfect. But it is a way to get change done relatively quickly. Society decides how many permits you want to have, so we can decide how much pollution we think is appropriate. We can decide whether you can bank the permits. Like, you can work with designing the market to make it work in a way that it meets the objectives that we have decided we want to meet. But it's been effective. You can get change done relatively quickly. You do it with a minimal squandering of resources, and economists hate squandering resources, so it's something that there's a lot of pluses to it. And if people don't like it, you can tax. If you want to make people pay for pollution, you can also make them tax. Again, there's sort of pluses and minuses about it, but having a conversation about those pluses and minuses, I think, could be helpful, as opposed to just saying, that's out of bounds. We're not even going to talk about it. Was that what the question was?
I think so. Professor Eggemeier, do you want to respond at all?
Oh, no.
No? You want to take on the economists?
No.
All right.
Not on economic grounds.
This is a more basic question for Professor Wolfe-Bellin. I mean, one of the things you talked about is the shifting baseline. How do you stop that, for one? So one of the questions was, how do we actually stop that shifting baseline? How do we establish markers that people can recognize and understand? And secondly, as we start to see the changes, when are we going to see the big changes that are actually going to finally convince people that something's happening?
The shifting baseline, I'd like to think maybe education is the solution. You know, sometimes in classes, even as you present graphs showing how things have changed, I think students can start appreciating, oh, we're talking about change, you know, that you can't see a trend until you maybe look at a larger trend. So I'd like to think education would do it. I don't know if that's the complete answer. The big change, when will we see the big catastrophic change? You know, I was reflecting on that as Tom spoke, and it strikes me that whether or not this looks like the end of the world probably depends where you sit. If you sit in the United States, I don't think it does look like the end of the world. But I think if you are sitting in the Middle East, where resources are very short and there maybe are wars over water, I think it maybe does look like the end of the world. So to that extent, we're pretty insulated here. So I guess I would answer that I do think some of this great change is already upon us, but I think we have to sort of remember other people in the world. And I think that's what Pope Francis is trying to get us to do. You know, think about this from a global perspective.
Please.
Yeah, Ellis Jones, sociology and anthropology. I was going to follow up on Sarah's question, which is usually my question, which is what can we do, right? We've heard the talk, now what can we do? And I'd like to spin it just a little differently, because I think it's often daunting to say, well, what can we do? What are people already doing to respond to the encyclical? Like, have institutions come forth and said, you know what, this is very serious, here's what we're going to do. Have colleges come forth? Do we have something like best practices for colleges that actually engage in this climate change problem seriously? Do we have best practices for students at particular colleges and universities that engage the global poor in a way that is very serious? What is already out there that we can take a look at and then say, here's what we want to do, and here's our unique combination of things that will allow us as a community to grapple with these serious issues?
Professor Kiel is actually the co-chair of the President's Task Force on the Environment. You could probably speak to at least what Holy Cross is doing.
So the College of the Holy Cross has signed off on the I always get the acronym wrong, ACUPCC climate change. So we're committed to reducing our carbon emissions by 2040. And we have made great strides in that. The college has worked very hard to reduce energy, doing things like changing lights, but also asking people to seriously close your dorm windows. Like so there is that. Those are the kinds of projects that we're working on. We also look at places like ASHE, and I'm not sure what that stands for either. This is embarrassing. But this is a group of higher education institutions where we, we audit ourselves. What are we doing right? What are we not doing right? Are we shopping locally? Are we recycling correctly? And there's a clearinghouse for that, and we can see what other schools are doing. And so I strongly recommend that people go and look at their website, at what other schools are doing, what kinds of things are working, and ask if there are other things we could be doing here that would be helpful. I think things like Trash to Treasure, which happens in the dorms every spring, I think that's an amazing program.
Which did not happen this year, by the way.
What?
Which did not happen because
Which
there
didn't
wasn't
happen
sufficient
this last
leadership
year.
among the students to make it happen this year.
Yeah. Where people at the end of the school year, instead of throwing things away that they're done with, can return it, like dishware to Kimball. But if you have something in your dorm room and you're just going to throw it away, why throw it away? Like So there were groups of students and faculty and staff who would gather these things up, store them, and then take them to various charities in Worcester where it could go to people who needed it. So those kinds of things, I think, are huge.
Just a couple of quick things that the college has done. It certainly started doing some composting now. Some of the material from Kimball is being composted now. Recycling has dramatically improved across the college. The electricity use is down, at least the carbon footprint. Now, some of that's kind of smoke and mirrors because we're buying hydro from Canada, but
We're buying hydro
well,
from
we are
Canada.
buying hydro from Canada. So there are some things the college has tried to do to address these issues, but there's always more.
A different kind of response would be, I think, towards the end of the encyclical is a section called ecological conversion. I mean, sometimes people criticize Pope Francis saying he's very pessimistic. He's talking about what's wrong and so on. But he also, I think, is very optimistic in some ways. I mean, he thinks people really can change their attitudes and values, that this is really possible, and on a fairly short time schedule, I would say. I mean, if you go to this last section about ecological conversion, he thinks, this is really possible, that people can change their whole view of the world and as our common home. People can come to see it as their common home, that that's really possible. Now, I think a lot of people would think that's unlikely, but I think he's very hopeful about that. And that grounds then specific things that one might do and so on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and he also talks about the role of education, that it's important that things are discussed and that information is shared and that people try to teach each other what they know.
Take the moderator's prerogative here. Oh, go ahead.
I think another grassroots movement that I don't know is present on this campus is the divestment movement. 350.org or 350 is one of these movements that's trying to get churches, public institutions to divest from fossil fuels so that people aren't making profits off of really destroying the natural world. My alma mater, that radical place in Dayton, Ohio, University of Dayton, has actually chosen to divest from fossil fuels. There's been a number of other college campuses that have done so as well. I'm not sure of a debate. I think usually it happens when students put pressure on administration, or at least it's raised as an issue when students start putting pressure on the administration as a grassroots movement.
Other questions? Other people that would like to chime in? Let's take the moderator's prerogative to ask a question myself then, because there's a bit of a tension in the document. On the one hand, as you say, there's an emphasis on education and sort of a grassroots change. There's also fairly strong-handed, there needs to be a change at the top, and on the way down, states have to act, we have to have international agreements, more powerful international institutions. If you have the ground, maybe it doesn't matter if you have the top, but do we have to have both? Is one more important than the other? I mean, what is the way forward here?
My feeling is that people are government, and if we're going to change the government and get them to act, it's because we are saying that's what has to happen. And so I hate to prioritize one over the other, but I'm going to, and I would say it's the grassroots. It's people as individuals acting, and part of that action is a political action of, talking to your representatives and say, I'm not okay with the fact that you're sitting around not doing anything about this. That's not okay with me.
This is one of the great examples where you have enormous amounts of money power at the top, and people aren't going to give away enormous profits just because they want to feel good about themselves, I don't think. And so I really do think this is one of the situations in which we need a mass social movement to put pressure on corporations and on governments to change their policies. This is particularly problematic in the United States of America, where a lot of politicians are in the back pocket of corporations, with Citizens United and other kind of policies being implemented, laws being implemented. So I really do think we need this kind of grassroots movement to put pressure on the government and corporations to change their behavior.
issues. If you,
Just a slightly different turn here on the whole question. I was struck by the reports that Pope Francis's popularity among American Catholics has slipped precipitously or significantly since his focus on this particular issue. And we've been talking mostly about what we can do here on the campus and focus on universities, which is great. What about movements within, or movement in general, within the Catholic Church? Is there hope that the Catholic Church will change and be more, and American Catholics in particular, can be moved on this issue?
just so that the question's clear on the record, the question was, can the Catholic Church also be moved to actually move more aggressively on these issues and achieve the changes we've been talking about?
I think it's, some places the priorities are quite other, and that's going to be a tough uphill matter, frankly. That said, I'm not entirely pessimistic either. I think it'll take a while, though. It's not going to happen overnight. There's got to be a lot of follow-up. To go back to some of this from above and from below, it's got to come from below as well. It can't just be from the Pope. There's a lot of work to be done. You know, say at the parish level or Catholic schools and so on. There's a whole lot that I don't think has even started most places, would be my impression. So, yeah, but that doesn't mean it can't happen. It can. But there needs to be more leadership than just from the Bishop of Rome.
Well, when this document came out to speak, I mean, as a younger Catholic, maybe myself, or in someone who's only kind of peripherally involved, I guess, with the hierarchy of the church, I had great hope, at least, that, so maybe amongst young people in the church who otherwise might be moving away, they would see this as a way to reconnect and hopefully could take some change from the, you know, sort of, again, that's the kind of the bottom-up move, but, so I'm probably one of the Catholics who actually likes the Pope better after this than may have liked some other sisters.
Any other questions? Yeah. Tom.
Just to follow up on what Father Worcester said about trying to have this kind of positive conversion and sense of vision. If we go back to Pacem in Terris, there was a vision there of global solidarity and building a single human family based on an understanding of human rights. That was a very positive vision. We weren't too good in kind of promoting that vision. What we did get good at was scaring the hell out of people about nuclear rampicide. And I can tell you here in Worcester, when physicians for social responsibility would come here and other schools and public places and say, if a low-yield nuclear weapon drops in Lincoln Square, here's what's going to happen. And all of a sudden people said, wow, you know. So that was kind of the negative side work, the critical side, scaring people. But the larger vision, maybe not. And the Pope is very big on that larger vision, that somehow if you don't get a sense of the global common good, a global sense of purpose, we're not going to make it. And I just recommend everybody here, if you get a chance, on the computer tonight, to look at the off-the-cuff speech he gave to university students and young people in Cuba the day before yesterday. It's just remarkable. It's just remarkable. And I think there, when he speaks, don't look at the prepared text, but to what he actually gave. And it is available online. And it gets right to what Father Tom said, that somehow, you know, you got to dream, and you got to dream, and you got to dream of doing it together. Communists, atheists, Catholics, everybody. You got to dream and you got to do it together. And I just think it's great if you can get that thought. And that's where I think maybe we have to ask ourselves, do our disciplines serve that global single human family common home, or do they not? You know? Were we critical enough of the disciplines in the nuclear era? We tried to be. I think there was a philosopher here like George Hamp, who was one of the founders of a group called International Philosophers Against Nuclear Rampicide. But they asked the question whether the intellectual life in general and our disciplines in particular are part of the problem and part of the solution.
If I could just add a note still on some of this about the nuclear war and so on. I mean, in 1963, Pacem in Terris was published in April. It was only a few months later a treaty was signed between the Soviet Union, the United States, and the United Kingdom for limiting nuclear testing, which was a significant step. I mean, again, the early 60s were probably the most difficult period of the Cold War, with the Berlin Wall that went up and the Cuban Missile Crisis and so on. So that treaty in 1963 was a beginning of a move in a much better direction of dialogue and stepping back from the possibility of nuclear annihilation and so on. So in what seemed a very difficult period where the worst was more likely than not, you know, things did move in a better direction, in fact, but it took work and cooperation and collaboration and, oh, yeah.
If there are no other questions, yeah, please. You mind coming up to the mic real quick?
Well, there's like this idea that's constantly mentioned about the grassroots and how starting from the bottom it slowly builds up and how that's going to cause change. But do you think without the idea of crisis happening, where people actually see the change happening right away, such as the like ozone, where people instantly thought associated ozone with cancer, that really hasn't happened for climate change? Do you think that will, or is it needed for something to happen?
Crisis, disaster is a great motivator for people to begin to examine what's going on around them. But even then, the grassroots change isn't always there. We've talked about kind of the macro and the micro levels. The meso level is also very important, and that's where you get a lot of social movement activity and a lot of change to happen. But again, I think as a number of people on the panel have said, I think the main issue is getting people to see that it's happening. Can you convince people that what's going on in California right now is part of climate change? If you can, then they might get on the same page. So I think it's getting people to perceive that we are experiencing it, and it's affecting all of us in some way right now. So then we don't necessarily have to wait for the big thing to happen.
Just to respond to Professor Eggemeyer's kind of suggestion about divestment, I just wanted to let everyone know that that's something that EcoAction is looking into right now. And so with the idea kind of, again, that we should do personal actions and smaller scale things, but also look to reform some of the more structural things in place. And so we are starting kind of a group to think about that and uninvesting the school's assets from fossil fuels. So if you are interested in participating in that, feel free to contact EcoAction, because that's something we're kind of talking about among ourselves as well. So just a heads up.
And now I'm going to hide from all the administrators going forward.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Anyone else? I do encourage you to go back, take this back to the dormitories, take it back to where you live, take it to your families. If this grassroots change that we talked about is going to happen, it's going to happen through the conversations that we have with those around us. You're here because you are interested or because you're getting extra credit. But either way, continue the conversation. Make sure that that continues to be part of what's going on. Enjoy some of the opportunities coming up on Thursday, on October 1st, October 6th. There are multiple opportunities to engage this material, and take advantage of that. It's a great opportunity. So thank you again for coming.